Hello, 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 and welcome to CogX 2021. Again, amazing that we're doing this virtually. It is my privilege to MC the Ethics and Society stage for part of today and all of Tuesday and Wednesday. And it has been wonderful to see Andrew Straight and the team at Ada curate such a fabulous morning. Hopefully you saw some of the sessions, but if not, you can always look back through the app. But also I think they're going to be on YouTube as well, at least they were last year. So my name is Alice Thwaite. I am the founder of Hatusia and the Echo Chamber Club. I'm a technology philosopher and ethicist, and it is my privilege to introduce the next session, which is going to be moderated by Max Beverton-Palmer. He is the director of the Internet Policy Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and this next panel is on queer tech, designing for diversity.
Welcome everyone to this panel discussion on queer tech and designing for diversity. As Alice said, I'm Max and I use the pronouns he and him. I'm Director of Internet Policy at the Tony Blair Institute, where we're building policy and convening spaces to better arm policymakers with the tools to master the tech revolution. We have a really exciting group of people here today to discuss the themes of queer tech. Dr. Krafft is a senior lecturer at the UAL Creative Computing Institute, where they also lead an MA in Internet Equalities. Phoenix Andrews, they are an expert on the cultural side of tech and social media, namely fandoms and political culture. And Dr. Shakir Mohamed, research scientist at DeepMind, and amongst many other things, has spoken eloquently on queering machine learning. So I wanted to do this panel as firstly my own experience with my LGBT+ identity, and particularly being open with it at work, gave me an unexpected insight and ability to do my own work in regulation and policy to a higher standard. But also then that's opened many doors for me to learn a considerable amount from people such as these people on the panel. And I want to give everybody else who's watching today an opportunity to learn about the concepts and perspectives they might not normally encounter, whether they're on the rainbow spectrum or not. And don't worry, we're going to start off with some definitions to help situate us. Do ask questions in the chat, and there'll be time at the end to field a couple. For me, queer definitionally is an amazing word because it can be either specific if you want it to be, or very, very flexible and non-definitional. But it generally means against the norm, but there's a lot more historical context to that as well. And I want to present two hypotheses to you to discuss today. First, that understanding queer ideas and the concept of queering can inspire us all to build better systems. Understanding the diversity of experience in gender and sexuality primes us as technologists and rule makers to be more innovative, more inclusive, and more creative. And secondly, that queer movements at their heart have often been protest movements, and that must be embraced and supported at the moment in tech development. We're at a tipping point where we are embedding values into advanced decision-making and analytical tools. We need to think very carefully about who we are representing and the very specific risks there are to different people. So in the context of that, thinking about the LGBTQIA experience and all those letters is fundamental. So to start off the discussion, I'm going to turn to Phoenix to help give us some grounding when we talk about queering and queer communities in tech. So Phoenix, you're an expert in fandoms and the cultural side of the internet. What could we mean when we use the word queer when we talk about technology, and how might we think about queering spaces and applying that to tech?
So obviously queer is the things that you said it was, but in academia and outside academia, for people who kind of are excited by the word and the possibilities that it has, queering means something more than that. It's not just about the LGBTQIA, it's about bending stuff to work better for you and for your communities, which is something that fans have been doing on the internet forever. You only have to look at archive of our own to see that, which is big. For those who don't know, it's a big fan fiction archive, and it has its own problems, notably with race at the moment, but it's a fan-built system and database, and that it exists in part because nothing out there existed that worked for that group. They just couldn't pull things off the shelf, so they had to look at code, develop code, work together on open source code as a community, and queer what existed, change it, make it weird, not just different, but outside of what people thought was even possible, to be able to do what they needed to do with it. And that's exciting. So fans, it came from the bottom. It wasn't somebody going, oh, we'll give these people an opportunity to do something. It was people going, we need something, we're going to build it.
And that's kind of super exciting about the creativity that can happen. So would you say there's kind of are there queer spaces online, or is it that there are spaces that can be queered or that are accidentally queered? How do we get to, because there's not just a kind of in the world kind of gay bar or kind of queer bar, there's threading of communities and different layers of communities throughout the internet.
So both of those things exist, where people create their own spaces, but also have queered or appropriated existing platforms. You might not know if you're not a gamer or you're not involved in lots of queer or tech spaces, but Discord is one of those technologies that's really been embraced by queer people in order to be able to have conversations that aren't necessarily public and can have lots more opportunities for things like information sharing. Like at the moment, I'm not really a gamer. I play Animal Crossing. I'm tragic in gaming terms. But I'm on quite a few Discord servers to do with transition and trans-related activism and trans-masculine support spaces for people who aren't just early in transition. And that's a case of people being able to start their own server within it, so they're not, that public. I mean, there's also obviously Game Queer Twitter and other big platforms, but that's very visible to the rest of the world. And at the moment, that's not particularly safe for trans people in particular because it's under attack. So there's a bit of both. I think there was a period where probably there was a lot more mainstreaming. Like initially, people were having to create their own spaces because they weren't welcome in mainstream spaces, and there wasn't enough in terms of numbers and power to be able to take over even small amounts of those spaces. And then there was a lot of mainstreaming, and then we've sort of gone back to its roots a bit, I think, in that the California ideology of, everything's great on the internet and everyone has free speech and the little people can rise up isn't really true, because minorities can be oppressed more on the big open internet. And therefore, queer people and people of colour have been going back to smaller spaces or side spaces or private chats within public platforms in order to be able to get some of that power back, or at least the power to organise, even if they speak publicly on those platforms.
That's very interesting. And before I turn to Peaks, I think it's interesting how the capacity to organise, in particular this STEM subjects in STEM areas, has kind of been. It's amazing to see the number of groups of kind of queer and AI and other queer organisation groups that are trying to kind of represent these views. So turning to Peaks, so your work sits at the intersection of civil society, academia, and computer science. When we think about queer identities, data science, and inequalities, where should we be working harder, and what are the opportunities we should grasp, particularly as machine learning and other advanced technologies become more widespread?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think a lot of the issues that come to mind first for me aren't really unique to tech. I think that, at least speaking from the experience of being a non-binary person, or kind of that version of a trans person, I think that there are just basic rights that we're still fighting for. So I'm based in London in the UK, and the trans healthcare here is really bad. Like the waiting list for gender-affirming hormone therapy is years long, unless you have the money to pay for private healthcare. I was surprised moving to London that the street harassment here is actually worse than in Oxford, which I never could have thought would be possible. But and just the day-to-day experiences of even being in a pretty queer workplace at the University of the Arts London, still plenty of like microaggressions and that kind of thing. When it comes to tech specifically, there is, I think, some overlap between how tech categorizes people and how bureaucracy categorizes people or codifies people. And so the denial of my right to exist as a non-binary person at the level of the state, I think is replicated and exacerbated by the way that that's very common in online forums and that kind of thing. But I think for me, getting past those simple issues is the, well, not simple, but basic issues is the first step.
Yeah, that's super interesting and depressing at the same time. I guess it sounds like it's who holds the authority to define who you are is really important, and street harassment is a version of somebody saying, I hold the authority to define who you are, not you. And then in the way I think about it in designing advanced systems, there again, somebody who you may not even see in the street may be doing the equivalent of harassment by trying to define who you are or who people might be within a system. So yeah, so Shakir, you've previously spoken about querying machine learning, and there's an excellent presentation out there on your website, which is kind of a fascinating but inspirational kind of speech as well. But what does querying machine learning mean?
Hi, thanks, Max, and just how amazing to be on this panel with these collection of people. And I really love sort of what Phoenix said in the beginning, this word of querying is bending or to make something weird. And I think that's a really great place to start from. I often just say to people that if you take queer life seriously, then one of the things it will do, it will just give you a more critical way of thinking and engaging with the world, which is just to say that all the things that we take for granted may just be the opposite of what we think they are. And this must be the beginning of a critical scientific practice for everyone who is a scientist, who is working that way. And I think this is core to the scientific method itself. The scientific method is based on a principle of skepticism. So you have to always be asking, well, this may be the wrong thing to do. This may be the opposite of what I'm thinking. And it has several kind of consequences for all of us, I think. So when we think about querying machine learning, then, whether it's to be strange, to be weirded, to be the opposite of what we think, then I think we can start asking questions. Why do we insist when we deal with data and ask questions of algorithmic fairness that we must have every person categorized in the data? And if they are not categorized in the data as black or white, as men or women, or people of various kinds, then we can't make fairness assessments, and then we do things which are sort of opposite to the kind of value system that we would like to do. And Queer Life always says we don't out people. We don't ask people certain kinds of things. That is their right, their resistance, their silence to deal with and control. And so when we then ask for more data, we are actually going against the kind of very core principle that queer theory, queer life, queer experience asks us to do. And you can take this kind of idea so many different directions. It's not just in the question of algorithmic fairness, which is so much on our lives, but it's in all the things we were talking about when we're creating online spaces for fans. And then now, because of the scale at which things, the number of people, we have so many content moderation tools, those things automatically flag people as a queer slang in particular as toxic. So you find that particular kinds of expression are not even possible online. I think there's something also far more fundamental. Maybe the word solidarity sometimes is the one that gets used. Maybe allyship is another one that gets used. Maybe there's just bonds of connection which are fundamental, that if you are querying your field of work, then it will ask you to take seriously other forms and other kinds of people that are living on the margins, that are being affected by technology. And I'll just give an example I was thinking of this morning. If we are queer people who are working in certain spaces and we are feeling that oppression of being erased from online spaces through toxicity and other kinds of content moderation, the same thing is happening to all people who identify as Muslim online. All these language models are only thinking of these people as terrorists, as people involved in danger, as something to be scared about, and no other version of that exists. And we sometimes isolate ourselves, but actually there are far deeper modes of connection for us. So I think this role of queering is not something that's only for queer people, for queer scientists, but it's something for all scientists. That if we really did take it seriously, I think there's a different way of building technology that is open to us, that we can bend, make weird, engage, and be our authentic selves without that kind of authority being imposed on us outside. And technology should not be the one that is that form of authority. Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And kind of, I think it's always good to, like, we have to be really careful in this conversation because there's a lot of work to do at the moment as a society in general to support people, to protect people from very, very real world harms, particularly trans people. But there's also this kind of other side to the narrative in that the existential experience of queer people can bring a kind of vision and a way of thinking that makes systems and makes things better. And I think there's a really, really nice thesis in there. Phoenix, you were nodding along. Is there anything you wanted to add on anything, Shakir?
Yeah, I always want to talk about queer joy because I spend a lot of the time dealing with the stuff that Phoenix and Shakir were talking about that's hard and awful. And my life feels like it's 90% admin sometimes, admin and dealing with harassment or organizing against harassment. But when things are good and we actually can take back some power for ourselves, then we can experience queer joy and find community. I mean, that's part of why I work on fandom, because like I would say, like, fandom has 3 parts, right? Anyone can be a fan of something, but to be a fandom, you have to take it as part of your identity. It's really important to you that you're a fan of something. It's as important as your queer identity or your football team is really important to people, as we know at the moment because of the Euros. It's important as any other part of your identity, that you are part of a community and that you intentionally join that community. So you can be a fan on your own, but as soon as you want to talk to somebody else about it or engage with other people generally doing stuff or go to events, then you're suddenly part of the community and you want to be part of the fandom. And just as people get joy as well as pain from watching their preferred sport or seeing what happens to their career of their favorite music artist, we can have that as queer people. When we find each other, we can do so much more than we can do individually, and it becomes less about how do we make the system work on a basic level for people who are queer, and more like what are all of the opportunities and things that we could do with this that are exciting, that we're not going to cut ourselves off from because, oh, people might not like it, or it's not normal to do that, or some guy on Stack Overflow says no. It's more like refusing to listen to no, because we have no so often in our lives that we should be able to radically say yes as well as receive the no's.
And so the kind of the legal and political freedoms that queer people and LGBT plus people have fought for over the last history, but particularly and got progress in the last 60 years. How can we make sure that those legal and political freedoms that we still need to kind of fight for today are better coded for in tech without defining people? And I think recently example of, and I would love to hear what you thought about this. In the UK census, there was a drop-down option in order to define your own gender identity, for example. And is that a good example of something, or a bad example? How does it sit with the rest of you in a kind of system design about collecting information?
You probably saw me pulling a face there, and it's because the census was specifically attacked by anti-trans groups, including a court case, because the guidance that went with the form. The form was, the sex question was the same question, and the guidance related to the sex question was the same as it had been in the last census 10 years ago, and they didn't attack it then. But they added the gender question, which lots of people asked for because it was not compulsory, which is good. So people can add it, but they don't have to. The government doesn't have a list of trans people because they didn't have to add queerness to it. And people could define themselves, which is good. But the guidance that they developed with lots of different communities, and this goes for the whole census, including the difficulty of naming different ethnic groups and so on as well. There was a lot of conversation around that. With Black and Asian minority ethnic groups. The guidance said that for your sex, you should put down, the bit before the gender identity question, you should put down what it says on your legal documents. And they gave several examples, one of which was birth certificate, one of which was passport, one of which was driving license. And and I think they also put gender recognition certificate, even though if you have one, that's how you legally change sex. You never have to show that to anyone. Like legally, you can't, nobody can ask for it. And because only the birth certificate and the gender recognition certificate are ones that require you to make a legal change of sex. Like you can change your passport to a different gender tomorrow with a letter from your doctor. You can change the gender on you can't change to no gender, which is crap for those of us who are non-binary, but you can change the gender on your driving license literally just by writing to them. You don't need a doctor's letter. Like, why would you? You don't need a doctor's letter to be gay. You don't need a doctor's letter to change your name, or to change to Mrs. if you become married as a woman. But that was the bit they kicked off about. And they got the guidance changed, but obviously it made no difference because throughout history, queer people had put whatever they felt like for sex, usually the sex they lived as. They weren't going, oh shit, I'm legally the other thing, I'm going to put that. They didn't. The census data has never been reliable. And I think there's an important lesson that we can learn from the census, which is that from talking to historians about the census, they were like, oh, there were people who were thinking this was accurate quantitative data about people who exist in the country. Actually, it's data about the stories people tell about themselves in the country and what they want to share with the government. So there are people who are excited to be able to share all of the complexity of their racial or ethnic identity. Like they'll put loads and loads of different bits down to a whole level of granularity to do with their heritage, which is awesome. But I mean, even 300 years ago, people were putting down kids that weren't theirs as theirs. They were claiming to be married when they weren't married. They were claiming to be a master seamstress when they were just a stay-at-home mum. Like they were defining themselves and their identity how they saw fit the whole time, and nobody could police that. And that's the thing we have to embrace. One of the problems with tech and forms and things like that is that you're always designing for pathways and drop downs and very little open stuff. There's very little opportunity to, most you get is a free text box that someone will later try to squeeze into a drop down list of options. People really want to be able to define themselves. A lot of people will pick the norm, some people won't. But sometimes when things are on paper forms and people would scroll things on to reflect their reality, that wasn't just an LGBTQ plus thing or a race thing. That was just generally people wanting to be able to tell their own stories about their lives. And that's something tech has to learn. How do we literally, in the possibilities that coding allows, which is quite rigid, you know, it's often quite binary. Here are a list of values that this system will accept. Here is an on-off switch. How do we literally code that into the text so that we can let people have more options to do things and make it not just something that you have to find out about through other people in the community, but that you can see the radical opportunities right in front of you to do what you want, rather than kind of have to find out through the back door. A bit like Peaks was talking about the difficulty of getting hormone treatment on the NHS in this country. You have to wait, 5 years to see the gender clinic, then you have to have your first appointment, and then you have to have a diagnosis appointment, and then you have to be referred on a waiting list to the hormone clinic. But there's actually a completely legal backdoor route that isn't private called bridging hormones, but you only know that if you're connected to the community. Your doctor won't tell you that, probably. The gender clinic won't tell you. It's all kind of shadow information. And when we're designing tech that has lots of opportunities, we also have to make sure the visibility of those opportunities are there, that we're there in Technicolor, that we've got the yellow of Peak's wall, that we've got the rainbow of Max's wall, that we've got the lovely browns that Shakir is wearing, that all of that is visible all the time so that people can embrace that and not have to find out how to work around the system.
So this is a really important point as well, isn't it? Because there's intersectionality as well, and there's intersectionality within the rainbow flag as well as outside of the rainbow flag as well. And the long list of letters in the LGBTQIA plus alphabet are not kind of mutually, they're not exclusive. So Peaks, I know this is kind of touching on some of your work on equalities and the internet. Can I bring you in there to kind of reflect on the importance of understanding these things, understanding diversity in order to protect?
Yeah, and apologies if you hear some drilling. Can you hear that? It's like, I can't tell if you can hear that or not. It's very loud for me.
Only a tiny bit, it's fine.
Only a tiny bit. Okay, that's good. Yeah, I think I don't know. One of the things I'm struggling with here is how much of this is about technology or about the internet, and because so much Phoenix was sharing so much wisdom and some things I knew and some things I didn't know, and that's just case in point of how important community and knowledge sharing is, and some of that happens on the internet, especially during the pandemic, like in the kind of urban context that I'm in. But I wonder also for the other panelists how much of this you experience from the internet or from communities that you've met offline, or
this is, I mean, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because it's kind of, for me, it's like helpful. It's been helpful to have labels, because then it gives you a grounding and like, oh, there's an experience here that maps, and then unhelpful because then because everybody's an individual after that, and so experiences don't map. And then I think this pathways point is particularly interesting one that I kind of want to bring Shakir on as well. Do you have any comments on that in designing systems in your research?
Yeah, I thought I'd just share one reflection just on the census, though, which was not so much on the sort of LGBT status and that ability of the story we tell of ourselves and then to be represented, which is about the racial categories. And sort of, again, how small little things enter into there. The racial categories in the census, rather than being alphabetized or randomized, always begin with white first, white mixed. The descriptions also tell you about the designer of that form. It's white, black, white, Asian, white, other. And then it goes down in order and ends up with black at the bottom. And it tells you a lot about the kind of racialized hierarchy. And that racialized hierarchy is, of course, very much prevalent in queer communities as well, coming back to the question of intersections of race and queer identities and many kind of things. So I thought, there are many lessons for us from this last census, as there have been for every census since it began in the 1900s. And technology has always been part of this kind of pathway towards categorization going forward. In the first census that used to be done in paper, basically in those periods, it was around 1920 or so, this punch card emerges as this machine, which transforms the census allocation from something that used to take 5 years or 10 years even, the new census was done before the old census was counted, into something that was done 4 months. And if you aren't critical, and I think I wanted to just say that some of this is about the question of representation and the kind of challenge of representation. Because they were in a space of non-representation, the largest tech company in that age was the IBM or Hollerith, which was the maker of those punch cards. This technology then gets used to start categorizing people, to digitize the church records. And what happens with the digitized church records? They get categorized, the census gets used, and then the greatest genocide of the 20th century then unfolds, precisely because there were tech companies that enabled this genocide and non-critical questions, because there is this lack of representation. All there was is this kind of search for profit and ignoring the reality of the world. So I think, there's a lot of talk particularly in tech, around unintended consequences. And people say, well, how would we see these things? But actually, they are very rarely unintended consequences. You just go back in history and you see the same patterns of oppression, exploitation, repeating themselves, whether it is the use of the punch card, which was the beginning of this computational power, which then comes into genocide, which then comes today to the exploitation of workers, which then goes to the facial recognition that gets used to marginalize people, Uyghurs in China. So there is this kind of long thread of things, and I'll just come back to summarize the point that I think it creates this conundrum of representation that we have, particularly in online spaces, that they have opened up our world that we can organize. Today, there is a challenge facing LGBT communities in Ghana. The government is insistent on closing down all those spaces, all those people, a tradition of queerness that has always existed far beyond or before the colonial era. But these digital spaces are the ones that actually allow and create that opportunity, yet at the same time, they are controlled by certain entities and they close them down. So I think the conundrum of technology is that it both creates and then closes at the same time. And, you know, our challenge, I think, for all of us, the four of us, and for so many others, is how do we navigate this tension of the challenge to make new spaces, new rights, use technology for productive and generative processes, at the same time not getting bogged down, finding this queer joy, and the joy of queerness then spreads to so many other places, right? To a racialized world that's no longer racialized, to a world that doesn't deal with inequality or seek to meet that way, and more, you know, dialogue, understanding of values and culture. So, you know, there's this is our constant challenge to keep navigating.
Yeah, I think it's such a difficult challenge, isn't it? Because this is why I think the kind of concept of querying is so important, because it kind of gives you a route into understanding different things. And so I definitely found that in my previous work. So I've been involved with regulation and government affairs and business responsibility. So I'm pretty much involved with the rules in different places and setting the rules. So, and often things are missed or intentionally deprioritized that often people deprioritize them because not for any particular nefarious reasons, although I acknowledge those do happen quite a lot, but actually kind of a common understanding of like difference and diversity of experience can be particularly important. I'm wondering if there might be some questions. I don't think we've seen any through the chat yet, but if anybody does have any questions for any of the panel, please ask away. But I wanted to kind of come back to this idea of kind of practically, what should we be doing? And kind of starting a list of better representation. What's the state of like representation of LGBT plus people in tech at the moment? If anybody wants to take that.
Well, just don't take what Graham Linehan told the I think it's the Women and Equalities Committee. He said that the reason why there's so many problems between people who consider themselves to be gender critical, who don't think trans people should have more rights. I think that's the politest thing I can say about them. And platforms like Twitter is that loads of trans people work in tech for those platforms. Now, there are quite a lot of trans people in tech, but I think it's because there's quite a lot of LGBT people and misfits just generally in tech, because it enables people to have more freedom. But one thing I would say is that representation isn't always the answer, because I've done quite a lot of user experience type work, both tech user experience and sort of physical space user experience design and paper information and stuff like that. And quite often people will go, well, we've ticked off the protected characteristics in the Equalities Act. Like we've got black and brown people in the room. We've got one of those. We've got none of those. We've got all of the LGBT people. What they've got is the people who like are easy to find, or who work in that industry, or who already rose to the top. Right? They're the people who were able to get past all the barriers to be in a position to be in that room. And you kind of want, when you're doing any user experience or diversity work, to have the most awkward people, the people who are troublemakers. I believe some of us called ourselves troublemakers when we were talking about this meeting before it happened. The people who say things that you don't want to hear, like some of the stuff around that Shakir was saying around like the order of races on stuff like the census and forms online. Some of that is, you know, people being racist, and some of that will actually be people of color doing that, going, well, it's really convenient, isn't it? If you're in Britain, there's probably a 90% chance you're white British. We'll put that at the top of the form, and we'll put UK as the country you come from at the top of the drop down, because it's convenient and it makes a better user experience. But if they'd had some awkward people in the room, not just representation, but awkward representation, then they might have seen more of that diversity.
I love the idea of awkward representation. I think that's a nice concept. Important. Peaks, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, thanks. Love what Phoenix was saying as usual there. Also, wanted to point out that I think was you mentioned, Max, at the beginning that queerness, we can't forget that a lot of queerness has involved protest, or certainly for me, my queerness is hard to disentangle from my rejection or deconstruction of multiple dimensions of the matrix of domination, and so to that extent, when I was reflecting on this panel beforehand, I was thinking that I'm actually pretty tired of being the awkward person or asking those questions. Like it is really a lot of work to be that kind of troublemaker, and it's thankless work that's not institutionally rewarded almost invariably, and so I hope that I don't have to. I mean, I hope most people in the audience already know this, but I think that one of the biggest things that queerness can do for tech is just encourage you to work less or just go part-time. Like just you can't have that space for trans joy or queer joy unless you have time for yourself. And yeah, I think be yourself, but don't give yourself necessarily.
I think it's such a kind of profound point, and I think from what I'm hearing from that and from other people, kind of often being queer is being forced into protest, whether you wanted to protest or not, and continually forced to do that. So creating space as well, I think, is particularly important, and getting other people to take up the battle. Shakir, do you want to make any kind of final comments in the last few minutes and leave this?
Yeah, I just thought I'd add that the state, in our largest AI conference a few years ago, or maybe 2 years ago, they did a survey of LGBT scientists and researchers, engineers at this conference. And one of the striking numbers was that of all the people, maybe around 42% or 50%, somewhere like that, said that they were actually out and felt comfortable to be out. So this is now an insight and lens on the state of queer tech, that 50% of people at our leading AI conference are people who feel okay to be out. So another 50% don't feel okay to be out. If you see a survey, there was a great article in Nature a few months ago, which will also say that 1 in 3 scientists have felt a kind of workplace environment that made them wanted to leave their work. So actually the state of representation itself, with all the challenges that both Peaks and Phoenix have brought up, gives one kind of question and burden that actually systematically we still have a lot of work to do. But I think the question that both Phoenix and Peaks are bringing up is that representation is different from participation. You can be included but not participate. And we must make the distinction between people who are included. We can all be included in the virtual space. I have my video on, I'm in the meeting, but am I empowered to participate? Do I have any power to participate? That's a different kind of question. And ultimately, when questions of power to participate come in, that's when this feeling of exhaustion comes in. It's the same voices that are always saying the same thing. You cannot find other voices because the mechanism of participation ultimately is one of a weak participation. It's about co-optation maybe in some places, or it's about appeasement that we had all these people. It's not really about empowering people, expanding knowledge, reshaping the way we do research, science, build new products, right, which needs a different kind of basis. So,
and I think again, there's a very specific point there about participation and inclusion, but there's also a more general point that you can apply more broadly to political systems, and when you're building new models of democracy or participation as well, that actually being empowered, that you're not only asked for your opinion, but you're empowered to kind of make some decisions, or that there's some level in which you have that control and power, not subject to arbitrary power. So it's a kind of it's queering representative democracy as the next step.
And you have the power to say nothing. You have the power not to vote. Refusal is a powerful form of participation.
Yeah, absolutely. Peaks, I know this is kind of maybe overlapping with some other of your work. Is anything on those spaces you want to add, or Phoenix, and any kind of closing thoughts?
One thing I wanted to say, following on Phoenix's point about there being a lot of queer folks in tech, and Shakir mentioning many of them who are out, just to say that in my experience, the Tech Workers Coalition and the Utah, the United Tech and Allied Workers, are very queer spaces, like mostly queer spaces. So if you're looking for a union, if you're looking for a trade union, check out Utah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Phoenix, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with Peaks on join a union, obviously, but also don't just join a union, organize within the union. Some unions are already queer. Sometimes the union that is recognized at your employer or, similar, where you are, talks a good game on being inclusive, but actually it's all about people's careers and getting higher, because it becomes a big monolith. Like any big organization, it's not necessarily malicious, it's just they file all of the edges off to make the system work. So sometimes it's about organizing within a union to be able to do stuff and find the other people that are like you within the union, because you might not find them within your direct workplace, but you might find community within the union. Find joy, go and have a great night out with those people, but also be able to carve out those spaces where you can direct the union a bit more, because I think sometimes people can feel not empowered by joining their union, or not empowered by voting, because they don't actually have that much of a say. It's like one of those consultations for redundancy at your work, where they listen to you, but they've already decided to get rid of 20 people. You want to be able to not just speak, but be empowered to actually do something, like you were saying, Max. Actually, not just kind of, oh, we'll listen to these people, or we'll listen to some of what that person says because it fits what we're going to do anyway. But actually be able to steer things, actually be able to have some of that power back, whether it's in things like participatory budgeting or citizens' assemblies or other things like that, or just asking other people, if you're somebody who is not a marginalized person, asking people who you don't see how they would fit into your organization, you don't see anyone like them, or the people who look like them certainly don't say the things these people say. Bring those people in and make sure that they're heard. Shove people onto the platform, as long as they're happy with it. Do not bully people into platforms. We're tired, like Pete says.
Well, I think I'm going to kind of finish on that point, both about the kind of when we're back to the real world, go for a drink, have a night out, or do whatever, go for a coffee with the people in the community, I think is a powerful thing of organizing, as well as kind of doing the hard work. But I've particularly kind of reflected on this, and that the first few stages of the tech revolution, we've got very good at collecting information and then defining that in a good or bad way, and then processing, and the listening and the output from the other end is still the bit where we need more innovation, both more macro and kind of government levels, but more specifically when we're supporting each other and properly designing for diversity. So with that, I kind of want to really thank the excellent panel for your contributions. It's a real privilege to have the conversation with you today. And I'll hand back over to Alex.
Thank you so much. What an interesting, thought-provoking and very passionate panel that was. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I have to admit, I was reflecting, there's so many points of reflection on that panel, but this idea of queer joy just made me think that so many organizations either feel very scared of ethics, or they feel it's something they don't need because they are already ethical. And what that panel has really brought out for me is just how joyful and innovative these kind of approaches can be. And also the fact that we're not really listening enough when it comes to ethics. So even if you think that you're ethical and you think that you're really good people, have you got the processes in place to do that? And I think that the conversation that we just saw there was just incredibly profound in kind of giving us ideas about how we can do that. So thank you so much. That was my personal thoughts. If you have any, please do use the chat function, use the networking function as well in the web app and the app, and do tweet at us. It's at CogX_festival, or use the hashtag CogX2021. So we'll be back in 15 minutes to talk about the future of AI, views from history. So please do join us then. I always think that the best way of thinking about the future is by looking to the past. So yeah, see you all very soon.